On December 12, 2018, Laura Luelmo was going about her daily business as she does every day, as suddenly after 4:20 p.m. she stopped making contact. The police immediately launched an investigation, during which they discovered a number of eerie facts that allowed them to solve the mystery of the young teacher's disappearance. Laura Luelmo was born in the early 90s in the city of Zamora in northwestern Spain. She was the daughter of Maria Teresa Hernandez, a civil servant, and Jose Angel Luelmo, an agricultural engineer. She had two siblings named Violeta and Angel. After high school, Laura studied fine arts at Salman University and worked at the National Library. She then traveled to Mexico and enrolled at the Autonomous University of Puebla, where she studied humanities. Laura's classmates described her as a very cheerful, funny, and intelligent girl who easily found a common language with everyone. After returning to her native Zamora, the girl dedicated herself to her vocation of teaching children. In the second half of 2018, she joined the staff of Nostra Senora del Rocio School, located in the northwest of the city, as a substitute teacher. Very dedicated, she won the love of all her students. At the end of the school year, she had the opportunity to take up another substitute position at the Vázquez Diaz Institute in the city of Nerva. It was for this reason that, at the beginning of December 2018, she moved to a hotel near the institute until a colleague rented for her a small house in El Campillo, almost 9 kilometers from the city of Nerva. On Monday, December 9, 2018, when Laura moved into the modest building on Via Cordoba in El Campillo, she never imagined that it would be the last place she would live. As she was getting settled into the house, she noticed something that made her feel uncomfortable. Her neighbor across the hall, a man a few years older, named Bernardo, caught her eye. She noticed that every time she left the house for work or shopping, he would stand at the door or window and stare at her intently. On December 12th, Laura went to work at the institute as usual. Bernardo was there again, watching her. She spent the day as usual, and when classes were over, she got into her blue car and drove home to El Campillo. Bernardo was outside the house again watching her. She texted her boyfriend, Teofilo Jimenez, to tell him about the situation, but he didn't have time for any help. Laura told Teofilo that she would go for a walk to be away from her neighbor for as long as possible. A few minutes passed, and at 4:20 p.m. she texted the boyfriend again, letting him know that she didn't know if she was going for a walk or not because it was too windy. But it is known that Laura did leave the house to go for a little walk. Then she went to the supermarket, where she bought some things. After that, the girl did not communicate with any of her loved ones. Laura's absence was quickly noticed when she did not show up for work. A colleague who rented a house for her called her phone but received no answer. Concerned by this strange silence, the teacher reported Laura's disappearance to the civil guard. At the same time, the girl's father did the same and, unable to contact her, filed a report about her disappearance with the National Police Station in Samori. At the insistence of Laura's colleague, the civil guard sent a patrol to Cordoba Street, taking the key from the landlady. They entered the house but did not notice anything strange. Nevertheless, they searched the premises but came out empty-handed. At the moment when the police officers were searching the house that Laura was renting, Bernardo Manto, the girl's neighbor, came out of his house. The officers approached him to ask if he had seen his neighbor in the previous hours, and he replied that he did not even know who she was, that he did not know who lived in the house, and that he hardly ever went out and had little contact with his neighbors. At first, the police had no reason to doubt Bernard's word. The man, who was carrying a basket and a blanket at the time, was free to leave, but the officers were left with a slight doubt, as they thought he was somewhat nervous. When they returned to the station, they decided to check his background and found that Bernardo Manto had an extensive criminal record and had only recently been released from prison. As investigators found out, the man had a hard time adjusting to society. He and his twin Luciana were born on October 13, 1968 in Catalonia, but they later moved with their parents to Cardigan. As a child, Bernardo was very close to his twin brother, and together they fought with peers, cheated and pulled off hurtful pranks. Once, while in 4th grade, the brothers set fire to a school classroom. These problematic tendencies did not disappear in adulthood. On the contrary, they took on more serious forms. For example, his wife and mother of his 2 children separated from him as a result of his abuse. It is also known that Bernardo had been addicted to drugs since the age of 22 and was involved in various property crimes. By the age of 30, he had already been involved in violent acts of a more serious nature. The first of these occurred in late 1995. Bernardo Manto was scheduled to stand trial for a home invasion and assault and battery case he had committed a few months earlier. In mid-December, an 82-year-old woman named Cecilia was scheduled to testify as a witness. Fearing that she would accuse him, on December 13th of that year, Bernardo Manto entered the woman's bedroom, where he hid and waited for her when it became dark. The accused came out from behind the door, lunged at Cecilia and caught her off guard, stabbing her 6 times in the neck, from which she died. However, this did not bring him freedom, rather the opposite. The civil guard continued to pursue him and caught up with him around Christmas. 2 years later, on November 5, 1997, he was found guilty of murder and obstruction of justice, in addition to the charges already against him, and sentenced to 17 years and 7 months in prison. Although Bernard's behavior on the streets was violent, in prison he behaved like a model prisoner. It was for this reason that he was granted a few days vacation in 2008. However, instead of taking advantage of this time and spending it with his family, he returned to criminal activity. Bernardo threatened a 27-year-old girl walking her dog with a knife and then stabbed her, but luckily she survived. The police caught him and gave him an extra year in jail for the offense. But that didn't stop him from getting another vacation the following year, 2009. This time he didn't use it to commit a crime, but to escape. Bernardo Montoy did not return to prison after that, and 10 months passed during which no one knew where he was. In fact, the police never found him. Bernardo himself volunteered to come to the prison to be put back in, and for this he was also given a year and a few months added to his sentence. With all that said, Bernard Manto's sentence ended in 2015, but his freedom didn't last long. 9 months later, he was back in prison, and this time for 2 violent robberies. He served his sentence from 2016 to 2018, and it was in November 2018 that the man went to live in El Campillo after serving his sentence. Thanks to all this information, Bernardo Manto became a suspect in Laura's disappearance. The authorities didn't know what they were dealing with: kidnapping, murder, imprisonment. They didn't understand what was going on. Would Laura's kidnapper demand a ransom or not? In the end, everything remained in doubt. Since Bernardo Manto was the only possible suspect, they couldn't let him out of their sight. The officers organized a small operation in front of Laura's house. It was supposedly done to keep an eye on the missing girl's house, but in fact it was done to keep an eye on Bernardo Manto. They didn't want the neighbors to talk about it, and they didn't want him to find out about it. However, Bernardo already had suspicions, and one night after Laura disappeared on December 13th, he ran out of the house and didn't return. A neighbor saw him leave and reported him to the police, but they were unable to catch him. The day after the escape, Bernardo visited the hospital. He also visited a woman in prison with whom he had a romantic relationship. The police again entered the girl's house to search it, but this time with her father and boyfriend. They knew her belongings well and could tell if anything was missing. Indeed, sneakers and pants were missing from the house, as well as her phones and keys. These items confirmed the hypothesis that Laura had had an accident while walking. Therefore, the search was intensified in the afternoon of the same day. On the morning of December 15th, investigators accessed the geolocation from Laura's phone. Thanks to this data, they were able to establish that she was near her home on the afternoon of December 12th, and that the last signal from her phone was received by an antenna in the El Campillo area at 9 p.m. Early the next morning, specialists and volunteers organized a search in a 5 kilometers radius around the village. This involved the use of helicopters, dogs, and even police officers to inspect wells in the area. In the afternoon, authorities found Bernard Manto's car, a black Alfa Romeo, at his father's house. Using surveillance cameras, officers followed the suspect, who drove his vehicle to the home of other relatives in another community. On December 16th, a second search operation was conducted, this time 10 kilometers around El Campillo, with more police, volunteers, and far more resources. On that day, the search team unknowingly walked near Laura's body but did not find it. The next day, a new check was made in the same radius. At 12:30 a.m., a volunteer found clothes in a field and reported them. About 200 meters away from these clothes lay the semi-naked body of Laura Luelmo, which showed various marks of violence. Only thanks to a tattoo on her torso was it possible to quickly identify her. Specialists were summoned by helicopter from Madrid and conducted a preliminary examination of the body and the scene. The investigators were certain that Laura could not have reached the site on foot on her own. The body was recovered at 6:30 a.m. and taken to the Forensic Anatomical Institute in Huelva. The discovery of Laura's body at this location was somewhat disconcerting, as the last signal from her phone was received many kilometers away in the opposite direction. The agents continued to investigate the only suspect. In the early morning hours of December 18th, they entered Bernard Manto's home, for which they had to break a window. After several hours of searching, investigators became convinced that it was a crime scene, particularly because of several bloodstains found in the room. Meanwhile, around noon, another group of police officers closely followed Bernard Manto's car. He drove through the town of Huelva and then took the route leading back to El Campillo. When he reached a road leading into a wooded area, he realized that he was being followed. He then decided to get out of the car and began to run away, turning off the road into the countryside. After a short police chase, Bernardo Manto was apprehended by the authorities and taken to the station for detailed questioning. After several hours of pressure to tell what he knew about Laura's murder, the man finally confessed. He confirmed that he had indeed been with her the day she disappeared, but denied having killed or raped her. Bernardo said that on December 12th, he was in the village and saw Laura. She approached him and asked him where the supermarket was. He showed her a path, but it was actually a trap. This path led her to a dead end. When the girl found herself in this place, Bernardo took the opportunity and attacked her. He hit her on the head and rendered her unconscious, then tied her hands behind her back and put her in the trunk of his car, covering her with a blanket. Bernardo then drove to a deserted place and there pulled Laura, still unconscious, out of the trunk of the car. He carried her to a field and decided to undress her. The man allegedly wanted to rape her but said he could not because he suffers from erectile dysfunction. Bernardo said he left Laura there, half naked but unconscious, and that she was still alive when he left. This confession was not at all credible to the investigators, given all the evidence they had. First, the bloodstains found in the living room of Bernard's house. By then, they had already been analyzed and it was proven that the DNA belonged to Laura. In addition, various genetic traces were found throughout Bernard's house, belonging to both him and the girl. Moreover, forensic examination of the victim's body established that she had indeed been raped and Bernard's DNA was found on her body. As additional information, it should be noted that according to the first forensic examination conducted, Laura's death occurred 2–3 days after her disappearance. This was also inconsistent with Bernard's testimony. Added to this were the phone signals from his phone and Laura's phone. They also denied that the events took place in the area. Everything pointed to the fact that it happened in the vicinity of the houses. Further evidence of Laura's presence in her neighbor's house were some items bought for her at the supermarket before the attack. For investigators, Bernard's lie was nothing more than a way to avoid a violent charge as well as a murder charge that could have resulted in a life sentence. A lieutenant colonel in the Central Operations Division of the Guardia Civil named Jesus said that Bernardo Manto was very impulsive and that he was a disorganized killer who thought that investigators would not be able to implicate him in what happened. The case continued to be investigated and caused some controversy. In January 2019, a second forensic examination of Laura's body was conducted, in which it was recorded that the first examination failed to correctly determine the day and time of death. The new conclusion showed that the girl died almost immediately and did not live even 8 hours after her disappearance. After these events, another one happened, which incredibly shook the case. Bernardo Manto radically changed his version of events. Now he said that he was only transporting Laura's body, and the real culprit was a woman named Josefa, a former friend of Bernard's whom he met in prison. The man's lawyer told authorities that his client lied out of love. At the time, his ex-partner asked him for help and he loved her, was out of his mind and under the influence of illegal substances, so he agreed to whatever she asked. It is alleged that to lend credibility to the story, Bernardo Manto gave the location of the murder weapon at this location, which was very close to where Laura's body was found. According to the man, there was a hammer, which was supposedly used by his former partner to take the life of the young teacher. However, the police conducted a search and found nothing. They also called Josefa to testify, but she did not show up and they immediately requested an arrest warrant. But as time went on, this line of investigation was dropped because Josefa showed up. She had an ironclad alibi, and besides, there was nothing to link her directly to Laura's murder. At any rate, this version of Bernard Manto's story offered no explanation as to why rape marks were found on Laura's body, and why his DNA was found on it. When the date of the trial became clear, the relatives of the victim and Bernard's defense agreed that everything would take place behind closed doors, without the presence of the media. During the trial, the defense continued to argue that Josefa was the perpetrator. In addition, to refute the rape charge, they presented the results of a medical examination, according to which the defendant was impotent. According to the defense, this condition did not allow him to be considered guilty of rape. The prosecution then provided their chronology of events, and according to them, the following occurred on that fateful day. That day, like the day before, Laura ran into her neighbor Bernard. But this time it was different. The man took advantage of the seclusion of the place and the darkness of the night. He used a metal object to frighten Laura and forced her to enter his house. Once there, the girl tried to defend herself and hit him hard in the jaw. It was because of this blow that Bernardo ended up in the hospital a few days later. Fearing that Laura would escape, the man tied her hands behind her back. He then took off her clothes and raped her, completing this perverted act. The man gave her several severe blows to the head, from which the young teacher died. This is why authorities discovered bloodstains in Bernard's home. Soon after, the man took his car, opened the trunk and put Laura's body in there. He then covered her with a blanket, got behind the wheel and drove to the place where the girl's body was later found. He took her out of the trunk and left her there. After that, he took her clothes, which he had also brought with him, and left them a few meters away from the body. This was done to confuse the authorities. Bernardo wanted people to think that the murder and rape happened there, so that the officers would not even think of searching his house. Afterward, he took Laura's other belongings, which he had also brought by car, and threw them in a trash can. When Bernardo returned to the house, he cleaned up as best he could, removing the most noticeable stains. A few hours later, he picked up Laura's cell phone and returned to the car. He drove to a place completely opposite to where he had left the girl's body and dumped the phone there. It was he who turned it off at 9 o'clock at night. In doing so, he thought that the authorities would not take him under suspicion, but apparently he was sorely mistaken. On November 19, 2021, a jury unanimously found Bernard Montoy guilty on charges of murder, rape, and unlawful imprisonment. On December 10th of the same year, the Provincial Court of Huelva sentenced Bernard Montoy to the capital punishment of life imprisonment, plus an additional 17.5 years for unlawful imprisonment combined with a sexual offense. He was also ordered to pay 400,000 euros in compensation to the victim's parents and sisters.
Sherry Coleman adored her spouse and simply desired contentment. When menacing notes began appearing, addressed to her loved ones, she feared most for her sons. Could an individual truly be capable of causing harm, even to her young children? This marks the beginning of the heartbreaking events that befell the Coleman household. Chris Coleman was born on March 20th, 1977, to a family of Christian pastors, Ron and Connie, in Chester, Illinois, Columbia. He and his two siblings were brought up in strict accordance with church customs. The Coleman household was deeply devout. Chris grew up as a highly compliant child, excelled academically, assisted his parents, engaged in sports, and took part in all church activities. He was an exemplary kid, student, and athlete, as described by his father. The coach was also immensely pleased with the achievements of this exceptional boy. During his elementary school years, Chris participated in basketball, baseball, and track and field. However, he was also known for being kind, sensitive, and the most introverted among the three brothers. While this trait was considered endearing in childhood, it was perceived as a shortcoming in his teenage years. His parents aimed to instill masculine qualities in him, such as resilience and perseverance. But this proved to be challenging. On one occasion, his father took him hunting, and they caught a rabbit. Ron proceeded to take the animal's life in Chris's presence, leaving the boy inconsolable and utterly distraught. He felt deep compassion for the rabbit and never went hunting again. This heightened sensitivity impacted his interactions with peers and led to numerous challenges during Chris's adolescence. The boy consistently felt that he lacked sufficient masculinity and struggled to express himself effectively. Chris recognized the need for change in his life to cultivate the necessary attributes of a man. When a Marine Corps recruiter visited his high school and discussed military service, Chris was captivated. He was so impressed by the recruiter's demeanor and public presence that he decided to enlist. Immediately following his high school graduation, Chris joined the armed forces. His parents responded to his decision with composure, understanding that the Marine Corps would provide him with the opportunity to develop the precise qualities he lacked. Chris even preemptively shaved his head, as it lent his face a more rugged appearance. The young man truly thrived in his Marine Corps service, earning numerous certificates and awards, feeling that he was destined for this path. In 1997, when Chris turned 20, he encountered his contemporary 20-year-old Sherry Weifs, a member of the Air Force Parliament. They met while both studying at a canine center in San Antonio. Sherry was born on July 3, 1977, and friends characterized her as a carefree, easygoing, and flirtatious girl who lived in the moment. Sherry was always curious about the surprises the future held. She had a desire to discover the world, which likely motivated her to join the Air Force. From their initial encounter, Chris Coleman appealed to her, a shy, pleasant guy, and Sherry's cheerful, carefree nature attracted Chris. They complemented each other well, leading to a quick connection and a rapidly developing romance. For Chris, this marked one of his first long-term relationships, as his upbringing had been quite strict and had not taught him how to properly conduct himself to win the affection of girls. However, Sherry's heart, open to all, knew no barriers. The girl was unabashed in displaying her emotions and expressing affection for family, friends, and now for Chris. In August 1997, a mere 3 months into their courtship, Chris brought Sherry to his parents' residence to introduce her to the family, presenting her as his girlfriend. His parents were taken aback by the revelation. From the initial encounter, Sherry failed to make a notable impression on them. Connie described her as a petite blonde girl clad in short shorts with a tattoo adorning her leg, an image that diverged from their envisioned future daughter-in-law. Sherry appeared neither intelligent nor attractive to them. The father was utterly perplexed as to how anyone could be drawn to her, believing that their son could have found a more suitable partner. The day following the meeting with his parents, Chris and Sherry embarked on a 6-hour journey to Chicago. During the trip, the young man contacted his father, Ron, expressing his desire to share astonishing news. He and Sherry had recently wed. The silence that ensued on the phone conveyed the father's lack of enthusiasm for the event. It came to light that Chris and Sherry's marriage was precipitated by the girl's pregnancy. Connie, Chris's mother, labeled her daughter-in-law a sinful woman who had ensnared her son into this godless union through pregnancy. In reality, the guy's parents harbored no specific grievances against Sherry. They simply did not hold her in high regard. Ron and Connie never uttered a single complimentary word about her, despite their roles as pastors who preached love and acceptance of all. Regrettably, it is not uncommon for many religious individuals to fail to practice what they preach to others. Upon their marriage, Chris and Sherry relocated to a tranquil suburb in Columbia, Missouri, with the intention of raising their future children there. Their first son, Garrett, was born in 1998, followed by the arrival of their second son, Gavin, in 2000. The decision to move was not solely based on the children, but also influenced by Chris's professional aspirations. The young man secured a position as a bodyguard for Joyce Meyer, a renowned American TV host, author, preacher, and multimillionaire. This woman appeared on television with the aim of converting as many viewers as possible to Christianity and encouraging them to contribute money to religious organizations. Naturally, her activities attracted a great deal of criticism, condemnation, and earned her a significant number of adversaries. Joyce Meyer's lifestyle was deemed excessively extravagant, as she utilized ministry funds to finance her luxurious home, expensive cars, and private planes. All of this contradicted the teachings she imparted to ordinary people. Due to her extensive work-related travel and the negative sentiment surrounding her persona, she required private security and a personal bodyguard to accompany her on trips. Chris was ideally suited for this challenging role. Joyce was, in fact, a close acquaintance of the Coleman family, having known Chris virtually since his birth. His military background and personal connection with Meyer facilitated his swift ascent through the ranks, ultimately becoming the head of security and the preacher's personal bodyguard. The position offered a substantial remuneration, exceeding $100,000 per year. This substantial salary enabled Chris to support his young family, while Sherry could focus on caring for the children and managing household responsibilities during her husband's travels. Coleman dedicated a significant amount of time to his work, putting in 90 hours per week. While he generally enjoyed working in security and appreciated Joyce herself, there were moments when he couldn't tolerate Joyce Meyer. His feelings were quite mixed. On one hand, he was content with the lifestyle that his position afforded him. Chris accompanied Joyce everywhere, and when she went shopping, She frequently bought him nice gifts. They had a close rapport, to the extent that he was familiar with her clothing size and the color of her underwear. At times, he admired Meyer, while at other times, he simply despised her. On the other hand, he suspected that the religious aspect of her work was likely fraudulent and couldn't comprehend how people earning meager wages would contribute a portion of their hard-earned money to religious organizations. Then, Chris would remind himself that he was still Joyce's bodyguard and would begin to defend her, claiming that she earned her money through her writing. After the wedding, Sherry, a young woman who belonged to the Catholic Church but had never given much thought to matters of faith, unexpectedly seemed to be born again. She became deeply devoted not only to her family but also to the church. Sherry planned and organized missionary trips, purchased blankets and food for those in need, and arranged charity events. She did all of this primarily for Chris and his family. Sherry understood the importance of religion to them, and even despite the terrible treatment she received from her husband's parents, she genuinely wanted to win the favor of her mother-in-law and father-in-law. When Sherry became a mother of two and started raising them, she truly became immersed in the faith of her husband and his family. While Chris was away, Sherry always bought gifts for him and prepared cute surprises. The woman told all her relatives and acquaintances what a wonderful husband she had. In reality, their marriage had its share of ups and downs, as they disagreed on many issues. And although he was constantly not at home, Sherry did not suffer from loneliness. Motherhood did not transform her into a mom on a net, tirelessly watching over her children. The woman was still full of energy, life, and fun, while simultaneously being an excellent mother. Both boys played sports. Garrett played football, while Gavin played baseball and was an avid fan. Both sons were an exact copy of their mother in character, just as lively, active, and cheerful. At the same time, both Garrett and Gavin were polite and obedient. Sherry was always on the side of her rascals, allowing them to have fun as they wanted, and was gentle with them. She believed that boys should be so proactive and sociable. Chris, on the other hand, insisted on discipline. He expected excellence from his sons in everything, from their manners to how they expressed themselves in sports. Chris always behaved a little aloof towards the children, was restrained, and did not openly show fatherly affection and tenderness, never hugging or kissing his boys, or his wife Sherry for that matter. Chris simply did not know how to express his feelings and emotions openly. Let's move on to November 14th, 2008. Joyce Meyer, Chris's employer, received many threats due to her activities. On that day, she herself, her husband, and son received a strange email. The subject of the letter immediately caught the woman's attention. It mentioned the family of her bodyguard, Chris Coleman, and the threat of its destruction. The essence of the message was as follows: whoever received this letter should convey the information to Chris and Joyce. The TD host was asked to stop her sermons, or otherwise the family of her head of security would suffer. The author of these lines pointed out that if he could not get to Joyce, then he would get to someone close to her. And since Chris follows Meyer on all trips, his family is not protected by anything. While he is guarding Joyce, his wife and children will die. The sender of the letter also knew exactly the schedule of all the upcoming planned meetings of the TD preacher. The next day, November 15th, Joyce's family and Chris received another email where the threats continued. The unknown person demanded a personal meeting with Meyer and that she return his money to him. If this meeting did not take place, then he would start sending her loved ones to the next world one by one, starting with the family of Chris Coleman. Over the next few months, the threats only worsened, to the point that this person put a letter in the mailbox at the Coleman family home. It ended with the words, "I'm watching you." This letter was not sent by mail. The unknown individual personally put it in the box. This occurred while Chris was out of town, accompanying Joyce in Hawaii.
Sherry, who opened the envelope, was very frightened. She immediately called Chris's parents, her family, and all close friends, telling them about the threats against her and the children. Chris took the threats to his family extremely seriously upon returning from his business trip. He reported the matter to the police, resulting in increased patrols in their neighborhood. He informed the neighbors about the potential danger and requested that they report any suspicious individuals seen near the Coleman residence. Fortunately, the neighbor living across the street from them happened to be Detective Justin Barlow of the Columbia Police Department. When Chris approached him, he volunteered to redirect his outdoor surveillance camera towards the Coleman's house to monitor their driveway and mailbox. On May 4th, 2009, this camera captured footage of Chris and his two sons, Garrett and Gavin, playing ball in the driveway. Tragically, just 12 hours after these images were recorded, the unthinkable occurred. On May 5th at 5:43 a.m., Chris departed from the family home to go to the gym. During his journey, he attempted to call Sherry to wake her up, but his wife did not respond. While exercising, Chris managed to send his wife numerous messages, inquiring if she had woken up and reminding her that it was time to get the children ready. He then wrote that he had about 5 minutes left of cardio training before he would return home, but all these messages went unanswered. Chris left the gym at 6:40 a.m. and began driving home. During the drive, at 6:43, he called his neighbor, Detective Barlow, and requested that he check on Sherry and the boys. He was concerned that he had not received a response to either his calls or messages. Given all the threats they had received, Chris was extremely worried about his family, especially considering the most recent email received a few days earlier on April 27th, which spoke of a final warning. The attacker hinted that the worst nightmare of Chris's life was about to unfold. Detective Barlow got out of bed, got dressed, and as a precautionary measure, called the dispatcher at the Columbia Police Department, requesting that several officers be sent to the Coleman's address. He crossed the street and knocked on the front door, but no one answered. By that time, other police officers had already arrived at the house. They walked around the building and noticed an open window on the first floor at the back. The protective screen had been removed, leading law enforcement officials to suspect that something was amiss, and they called for reinforcements. Upon entering the house, they immediately realized that a crime had taken place there. All the walls inside were painted with blood-red spray paint. There were inscriptions such as, "I'm watching you," "Punished," "You paid," and so on. All the bedrooms were located on the second floor, and that's where the police discovered the lifeless bodies of 31-year-old Sherry, 11-year-old Garrett, and 9-year-old Gavin. They were all lying in their beds, showing no signs of life. Sherry had been brutally beaten. Her naked body was lying face down, and a vulgar expletive was written on the wall of the master bedroom. The perpetrator didn't even bother to cover the poor woman's body with a sheet or throw a blanket over it. Gavin, who had celebrated his birthday just 5 days earlier, was only partially covered with a sheet on which an obscene inscription was written. The body of the older son, Garrett, was completely covered with a blanket, and there were no inscriptions on it, likely because the attacker had run out of spray paint rather than out of mercy. There were no signs of struggle on the boys' bodies, indicating that everything happened while they were asleep. Shortly after the horrific discovery, at 6:56 a.m., Chris arrived at the house. Detective Barlow went out to meet him, blocked his path, and informed him that no one had survived. They were unable to save them. As the house was already cordoned off as a crime scene, Chris was instructed to remain outside and not enter. The homeowner did not argue. He turned around, sat right on the driveway, and called his father. The Columbia Police Department immediately requested the assistance of the Major Crimes Unit, and Chris Coleman was taken to the police station for a detailed account of that morning's events. According to Chris, he woke up around 5:30 a.m. Sherry was still dozing. He kissed her and went to the gym, from where he tried to call several times and send several messages. Not receiving an answer, the man became worried and hurried to finish his workout. Upon leaving the gym, the first thing he did was call Detective Barlow and ask him to check the house. The investigators asked Chris if he had noticed anything strange that morning. He said nothing special. The only unusual thing was a car that he encountered near the house. The car specifically slowed down to allow Chris to drive out of the driveway as he headed to the gym. At this time, the police were viewing Chris's phone, home computers, and the recordings from that morning from Detective Barlow's surveillance camera.
The investigators found several aspects of Chris's behavior and statements suspicious from the very beginning. When he returned home from the gym and was informed that his entire family had been killed, he showed almost no reaction to the devastating news. While everyone processes grief differently, Chris did not ask a single question or attempt to enter the house. Detective Barlow had anticipated needing several officers to restrain the distraught neighbor upon learning about the deaths of his sons. But Chris simply sat on the driveway and began calling his parents. His demeanor did not align with that of a grief-stricken father and husband who had just lost his entire family. Later, at the police station, when asked if he and Sherry had argued the night before, he covered his face with his hands and pretended to sob, but it appeared contrived to the trained eyes of the detectives. Another point that raised doubts about Chris's story was the presence of redness, scratches, and bruises on his hands. This could suggest that he had recently been involved in a physical altercation, and considering that Sherry had been severely beaten before her death, it seemed too suspicious to be a mere coincidence. Additionally, before Chris was taken to the Columbia Police Department for questioning, members of the press rushed to the Coleman family's house. To avoid further traumatizing him, the police asked him to sit in the back of an ambulance alongside his father Ron and a police chaplain. They sat in silence, lost in thought, when Chris suddenly began to beat his fists on the gurney in the back of the vehicle, as if the reality of what had happened to his family had just dawned on him. In fact, 2 minutes earlier, he had noticed the marks on his hands that he likely had not seen before. During the interrogation, when the police inquired about the red marks on his hands, he claimed that something had come over him in the ambulance, causing him to injure himself. However, Chris was unaware that the police chaplain had already informed the detectives about his odd behavior. Despite the interrogation room being sufficiently warm, Coleman requested a blanket, which he used to carefully conceal the bruises and scratches on his hands for most of the conversation, hoping they would go unnoticed. Regarding the car that supposedly slowed down when Chris pulled out of his driveway in the morning on his way to the gym, investigators reviewed the footage from the surveillance camera at Detective Barlow's house, which was aimed at the Coleman's residence. The footage revealed that Chris had left the driveway unobstructed at 5:43, with no other vehicles in the vicinity at that time. It appeared that the man was attempting to insinuate that the person behind the wheel of the car who allegedly let him pass could potentially be the stalker responsible for the massacre of his family. Furthermore, the surveillance camera footage indicated that no one else had entered the Coleman house between the time Chris left and when the bodies were discovered. Moreover, the man's own account sounded like a well-rehearsed performance, too unnatural for someone who had just lost their entire family, including 2 young sons. The pathologist's determination of the approximate time of death further complicated Chris's story, with the entire family, including Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, having died between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., and Chris leaving the house at 5:43 a.m. His claim that he woke up, kissed his wife, and went to the gym became highly suspect. When police officers informed him that Sherry and the boys had passed away before he left the house, Chris expressed great surprise. He began to insist that his wife was lying next to him on the bed and that he believed she was alive. However, he omitted the detail about kissing Sherry before leaving, as it would have sounded completely absurd. Even if we were to assume that the entire family was killed while Chris was sleeping and he didn't notice it when he left, it would be implausible for him to have walked past the walls painted with spray paint without noticing. Clearly, Chris Coleman was caught in a lie. When he handed over his phone to the investigators, he hoped that the text messages sent to Sherry from the gym and the unanswered calls would provide him with an alibi. Instead, they revealed the true nature of their family relationship. It turned out that Chris rarely, if ever, texted or called his wife, making the long list of consecutive SMS messages interspersed with calls on that morning highly unusual. Even during extended business trips, Chris did not communicate with his wife in this manner, so his sudden decision to make up for lost time on that particular morning seemed strange. Detectives uncovered evidence that the relationship between Chris and Sherry was not as straightforward as it appeared. The man was having an affair with Sherry's school friend,
a woman named Tara Lintz. To gain a clearer understanding of the relationship dynamics between the Coleman couple and the issues they faced in their marriage, let's take a step back. After the birth of their second child, Gavin, Sherry requested that Chris adjust his work schedule to spend more time with the boys, as he was away from home most of the time. His sons even had a calendar on the refrigerator where they counted down the days until their father's return. However, Chris completely rejected this idea and began to distance himself even further from his wife and children. He openly told friends, parents, and even neighbors that he believed Sherry and his sons were keeping him from fulfilling God's purpose and were standing in his way, preventing him from moving forward. Chris started to agree with his parents' view that his wife was the root of all his problems and that she had deliberately gotten pregnant to trap him into marriage. Chris was very indignant about Sherry's spending habits and complained to one of the neighbors that while he was working 80, 90 hours a week protecting a millionaire lady, his wife was sitting in a big, beautiful house, wasting money. The fact that Sherry was spending money on their children, household expenses, as well as on charity and the church, infuriated him. He believed that everything he earned belonged to him and wanted to spend it solely on himself. Despite this attitude, Sherry loved her husband and did not want to give up on their marriage, even though it was difficult for her. Chris never paid attention to his wife, never hugged or kissed her, even during intimate moments. Sherry, in turn, also shared her feelings with her friends, lamenting that she loved Chris too much and that his coldness towards her and the children broke her heart. Chris wanted a divorce and even discussed it with his employer. He knew that the preacher did not approve of divorces, and the matter could result in his dismissal. Joyce advised her bodyguard to seek advice from a family psychologist, which they did. The very first counseling session appeared successful, with Chris making every effort to keep the family together and following all the recommendations of the specialist. However, this turned out to be just an act, as Chris was simultaneously engaged in a passionate affair with Sherry's best school friend, Tara Lintz. In November 2008, the entire Coleman family traveled to Florida, where Joyce Meyer was holding a conference. Sherry, unaware of the potential consequences for her marriage, wrote to Tara expressing her desire to meet and chat, and invited her to attend Joyce's conference. This is how Chris met his future mistress. Interestingly, Tara shared many similarities with Sherry. She had the same dark hair, a similar figure, and personality. The only difference was that she was never overly persistent. Tara was a mirror image of Sherry before marriage, cheerful, flirtatious, and carefree, living one day at a time, or at least that's how Chris perceived her. Tara worked as a hostess in a gentleman's club before securing a job as a waitress at Derby Lane, where dog races were held. Chris saw her as he remembered Sherry, mischievous, attractive, and captivating the hearts of men. Their romance was not a fleeting affair. They almost immediately confessed their mutual feelings and communicated around the clock. Chris kept a note on his phone titled, "Tara Who Changed My Life," where he recorded details from the day they met. It contained all the information about this woman: the color of her eyes, her jeans size, underwear size, her favorite perfume, and flowers, which included tulips and pink roses. Chris had a list of gift ideas, including an engagement ring he intended to give her for Christmas. They discussed future children, chose names for them, and even talked about their wedding plans. Chris and Tara planned to get married in January 2010, and the mistress went as far as registering at the marriage registry. They had even selected rings for themselves. When Chris went on business trips, he paid for Tara's plane ticket. They traveled together to Phoenix and Hawaii, staying in the same hotel room. Numerous intimate photos and videos that they took for each other were also discovered on Chris's phone. Shockingly, even explicit photos of Tara were found on the computer belonging to Ron, Chris's father. The son had sent them to his father and shared details about his affair. The most disturbing aspect of the situation was that both Ron and Connie were aware of their son's infidelity, yet they approved of these extramarital relationships and supported Chris, despite being pastors. They believed that Sherry was not taking proper care of their boy and was neglecting her marital duties, which they considered the most important aspect of a relationship. They justified the affair by claiming that Sherry was not gentle enough, never complimented Chris, and kept telling him that he was capricious, which explained his attraction to the affectionate and always cheerful Tara. Sherry herself suspected an affair just a few months before her death. The date November 5th, 2008, the day Chris met Tara, appeared in the notes on Chris's phone related to his mistress. The police also took note of this, as 9 days later, emails with threats against Chris's family began to arrive. Information from the mobile phone revealed that Chris was exchanging text messages with Tara, in which he mentioned his intention to hand his wife divorce papers on May 4th, but the lawyer had made an error in writing Sherry's name. Chris stated that he would correct the mistake and give his wife the papers the next day, but he never had to do so, as on May 5th, his entire family was killed. The interrogation of Chris Coleman lasted approximately 5 hours, during which the detectives gathered all the information about him. When questioned about his mistress, Chris denied that there was anything more than a casual flirtation between them, claiming he would never do such a thing to his children. He portrayed his marriage to Sherry as an ideal union of two lovers. However, Chris was unaware that the investigators had already spoken to Tara Lintz, who had provided them with detailed information about their affair. Tara assured the police that she had no idea her lover was plotting something so horrific, but her demeanor suggested a sense of pride that a man was willing to commit a crime for her, showing no concern for the fact that her best friend from school had been found dead in her bed. Tara even boasted to the officers that Chris would send her photos of Sherry sleeping in the evenings as a guarantee that they would not engage in any intimate activities that night. On May 19, 2009, Chris Coleman was arrested at his parents' home and charged with the particularly heinous triple murder of his family. The trial commenced on April 25, 2011, and he pleaded not guilty to the massacre of his wife and children. During the proceedings, the previously mentioned case materials were presented. Tara testified as a witness, wearing the promise ring that was referenced in Chris's phone notes. Additionally, a significant amount of new information emerged during the investigation. It was revealed that all the threatening letters sent to Joyce Meyer and the Coleman family had actually been sent from Chris's laptop. The words from the emails were repeated on the walls of the house, written with spray paint and containing the same spelling errors as in the printed version. These identical mistakes were also found in other notes written by Chris and discovered in his office. Furthermore, a 3-month-old credit card payment for the purchase of a can of red paint, which was used for the inscription at the crime scene, was found on Chris's computer. A glove with traces of spray paint, discarded by Chris on his way to the gym, was also discovered near the interstate highway. The court was provided with video-recorded testimony from Joyce Meyer, who stated that on May 4th, Coleman had requested a day off for the first time in many years due to feeling unwell. Additionally, Sherry's friend, who had spoken with her shortly before her death, recalled a strange phrase. Sherry had said that if anything happened to her, it meant that Chris was responsible. On May 5th, 2011, the second anniversary of the deaths of Sherry, Gavin, and Garrett, the jury found Chris Coleman guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. They also recommended the death penalty for his actions, but the judge ultimately sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Chris attempted to appeal his sentence, but was unsuccessful. Currently, Chris Coleman is serving his sentence in a correctional facility, where he acts as a preacher. He counsels other inmates on religious matters and provides spiritual guidance. Despite this, Chris maintains his innocence. His parents, Ron and Connie, continue to fight to overturn the sentence, believing that their son was wrongfully convicted. They have not uttered a single kind word about Sherry, even after her tragic death. This heartbreaking story serves as a stark reminder of the potential for evil that often lurks within individuals, hidden behind a veneer of normalcy. On February 9, 2011, in an ordinary apartment in the city of Maywood, USA, police officers found a horrible discovery in the refrigerator, and also on the walls were human remains in bags. There were satanic symbols everywhere, indicating that a sacrifice had taken place in the house.
Amelia Espinosa was a devoted mother. This is the first thing that comes to light when studying her life, although the rest of the details of this woman's biography remain a closely guarded secret. It has been learned that she was born in the late 60s, apparently in Mexico. Then, like many of her compatriots, she migrated to the United States, and it was in this country that she lived her entire adult life. She was not alone, for according to the little information that has been discovered, her other relatives lived there, and they all supported each other. Be that as it may, at around the age of 24, Amelia gave birth to her first and only child. It was the early 90s, and the young mother decided to name her firstborn Moses in honor of the founder of Judaism and prophet of the Old Testament. His full name was Moses Miras Espinosa, and from that moment Amelia fully devoted herself to her son, doing everything possible so that the little boy did not need anything. Only the last name Miras is known about the father, and judging by the information, he was not always present in the life of Moses, but they kept in touch and communicated with each other, especially in difficult times. In time, the little family found their home in Maywood, a small town in Gateway County in southeast Los Angeles County, California. There, in a pink-color apartment complex near Prospect Avenue, mother and son settled into apartment number 11. Neighbors soon witnessed Amelia's devotion to her firstborn son, but it was later discovered that the boy was into some creepy music, much to the woman's annoyance. She was ashamed that he was disturbing the peace of the community in this way. As is often the case with many teenagers, Moses' musical predilections took hold. However, there was no shortage of those who called this particular taste of the young man an obsession, especially to heavy metal. In turn, after immersing himself in the subject, the lad turned to death metal, an extreme subgenre that tended to have the distorted sound of low-tuned guitars. When he turned up the volume, no one nearby could abstract the music. In the heavy metal universe, King Diamond has become Moses' favorite spokesman. His real name is Kim Benedict Peterson. He is a Danish musician who is considered by specialized publications as one of the 100 most influential vocalists in metal. He is considered a unique representative of the genre, also because of his distinctive voice, his bizarre makeup, his lyrics, stories, and special effects on his songs. But one aspect that has certainly cemented his fame is his differing attitudes towards Satanism. Specifically, King was a follower of the atheist Satanism movement founded in the 60s by American occultist and writer Anton LaVey. This cult had its own satanic Bible, and for King it was not just a religion, but his philosophy of life. This is what made him one of the true representatives of the satanic metal rock genre. In the 80s, however, Anton LaVey's scandalous and deeply heretical lyrics, according to his critics, declared his tolerance for various religious ideas, and also noted that what he found truly disturbing was the ability of people to confront and destroy each other in the name of God. Amelia was extremely concerned about her son's strange tastes and tried to persuade him to diversify his musical choices, but according to neighbors, this infuriated him. Moses, meanwhile, chose the darker side of his rock metal star heritage, and one of the first things he did was buy a satanic Bible as his musical hero, and added to his catalog of preferences gourd grind, a musical subgenre of the late 80s in which voices are so low that they create a frightening and even oppressive atmosphere, as they resemble the voices traditionally used in horror films for diabolical or possessed characters. Death metal, according to analysts, represents restlessness and a certain desire to control everything that is perceived as a threat. Its symbolism is full of scenarios of death and destruction, supernatural horror and violence in general. Such was the world into which Moses was immersed day in and day out. In addition, he always dressed in black and covered his body with tattoos of symbols that his mother found disturbing. At the time, Amelia worked as a seamstress and was a mother like any other. She always cooked her son's meals, washed his clothes, and took care of him. To her neighbors, she was a charming woman, and the opinion of Moses was that he was an ordinary young man like most of the people of the place. Although Amelia did not understand or share her son's tastes, she was generally quite respectful of him. The real cause of frequent quarrels for her was the music the young man listened to at full volume, especially because it disturbed the neighbors. While all other aspects of Moses' daily life, be it his social life, interests, dreams, fears, or even his psychological profile, could not be ascertained. According to some reports, around the middle of 2010, he met a girl named Monica. They immediately fell in love with each other so much that after a while they began to live together, and then got a job at a cookie factory. Day after day the couple would leave the house with the best of vitality. They would hold hands and make plans for the future along the way. It seemed that Moses' path was the right one, as his colleague Alfonso Balthazar pointed out. It didn't take long for the guy to prove himself. He was punctual, never truant, took his work seriously, and soon his superiors thought about moving him to a higher position. At the same time, he and Monica were going to study, but one day on the way to the factory, the girl was hit by a car. She could not be saved. Since then, the young man's behavior has changed. It is unclear whether it was before, but it is clear that in the pain of losing his soulmate, Moses became heavily involved in the use of illegal psychoactive substances. From that point on, violent outbursts became frequent and difficult to control. Amelia was eventually exhausted and confused. At the age of 18, Moses locked himself in his home and himself out. And within these four walls, quarrels between him and his mother became a daily occurrence. Meanwhile, another person was concerned about Moses' behavior, his sinking into a kind of emptiness. Liliana Rivera, his cousin, the only relative besides Amelia whose name was revealed at the same time. Rumors were already spreading among the neighbors that Amelia was afraid of her son. The young man displayed an increasingly aggressive and disrespectful nature. Around 2010, Liliana became concerned that as a result of his excessive fascination with the satanic world, he might harm himself or someone else. Wednesday, February 2, 2011, was not too different from any other day in the family, especially since once again there was a heated argument between Moses and his mother. All indications were that Amelia had once again rebuked him for the loud music coming from his room. Only this time, evil has finally found a willing servant. Out of the blue, Moses pulled back the curtains, made the sound even louder and, using a rope, cut off the blood flow around the neck of his mother, who was 42 years old at the time. The cries for help from the woman who gave him life were drowned out by the low chords and King Diamond's voice coming from the speakers. In the end, Amelia succumbed to the attack of the man she loved most in the world. After what happened, Moses went to bed. For the next 2 days, he considered various options to get rid of the body. His gaze was lost. At times he laughed alone. Finally, his insight and intuition told him the answer and he armed himself with power tools and disposed of the remains. The operation was carried out in the bathroom. Then the packaged parts were placed in the freezer in the living room, along with the other parts. And from there, everything went on as it is stipulated in satanic rituals, with the application of crosses and symbols. However, after 2 days, Moses began to doubt his method and wondered how long he could keep this position. He climbed onto the roof of the house, placed a flower pot on his head and sat like that for quite some time. Neighbors saw his strange behavior but assumed that he was probably under the influence of illegal substances. Epifanio Hernandez, the manager of the apartment complex, told ABC News that he had been talking to the young man for days because he needed to get into the house. But Moses made all sorts of excuses to keep him out. The same fate befell the neighbors, who were worried when they saw that Amelia had not left the house for several days, and came to ask if she was all right and could come in. However, Moses would not let anyone inside the apartment. Epifanio explained that he was installing new sinks in all the kitchens in the apartments, and that's why he insisted on going inside Amelia's house. But the guy told him to come back next week. All these people taking an interest in his mother and the handyman's urgent work to install the new sink made Moses think that it was urgent to get Amelia's remains out of the house. Then he remembered that his cousin Liliana was a professed Santeria. It could not be ascertained whether he was moved by a desire to get rid of the trouble, or whether he simply longed for confirmation of his absurd act. Whatever the case, he contacted Liliana and asked her what was the worst act the followers of Santeria had committed, given their background and peculiar approach. On the other end of the wire, Liliana experienced a strong emotion. So she got into her car and went in search of her cousin. Moses was waiting outside the house when she arrived. Liliana asked him where her aunt was, to which he replied that she was not at home. But the girl had a premonition, and this time a very bad one, so she insisted and asked where she had gone. When Moses said that Amelia had just left, Liliana felt fear overwhelm her. The guy then got into the car and soon confessed to her what he had done, but she didn't believe him. The girl said it couldn't be true. Then, in a breaking voice, Liliana asked how it had happened, and Moses began to describe and detail the entire sequence of actions, including the fate of the bones, skin, and weapons used. Her cousin didn't leave out any information. He even told her that the music had been used to cover up the ominous sounds of the chainsaw, and not to arouse suspicion from the neighbors. At the end of his story, Moses made a statement no less chilling than the above. He said that after the fatal attack on his mother, he felt peaceful. Moreover, in his own words, he felt like an angel. It had been about a week since the crime, at which point he asked Liliana to help dispose of the remains. In shock and with a barely audible tremor in her voice, she managed to convince him to surrender, and she drove him to the police station in Huntington Park in South Los Angeles. Once there, still outside the station, Moses called his father and informed him that Amelia was no longer among the living, that she was asleep, and that he had helped her get away. As his words were rather muddled and punctuated by sobs, it was difficult for his father to understand what he was saying. A few minutes later, Moses entered the police station. It was exactly 13 on the clock. Stumbling in with the first policeman he saw, he gave a detailed account of the crime he had committed. And then, when a sheriff's deputy arrived to take him to East Los Angeles, he asked if he knew why he was being detained. Moses again answered truthfully, and before the police officers did, the guy provided an additional detail he hadn't previously mentioned. The remains were still in the apartment he shared with his mother. Police officers immediately went to the house, and once there, they came across the epitome of a horror movie. In the middle of the living room, an overturned refrigerator lay on the floor, and like an evil aura that could not be gotten rid of or even forgotten, the stench pierced every particle of air. When they opened the refrigerator, they found plastic bags of remains, as well as other bags on the walls. The circular saw with remains of blood, flesh and bone, and a knife in the shower walls. They were covered with plastic sheeting that painters used to protect against paint splatters and secured with duct tape. In addition, blood particles were visible in this part of the house. Further, a backpack was lying in the next room, and in it, officers found human bones in a skull with inverted crosses painted on it. Officers also found an aerosol cleaner, likely indicating an attempt to cover up what had happened. A search of Moses' bedroom found a collection of items of definite concern in addition to his laptop, including a DVD of the movie Saw and a satanic Bible that noted a chapter on human sacrifice. Given everything they had observed before, it was impossible not to notice the drawings on the closet door. All of the images there were associated with devilish beliefs. When the neighbors saw the police officers, they said that Amelia was afraid of her son's outbursts of aggression and scolded him for going at night to people of dubious reputation and using illegal substances. Hours later, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department confirmed to the media that the body had been found. However, the coroner's lieutenant, Brian Elias, warned that because the body had been dismembered, it could not be properly identified. As expected, this news was greeted with horror. Meanwhile, Moses was detained by the sheriff's department without bail and arrested on suspicion of being the perpetrator of all the violence that led to the death of his mother, Amelia. After the news grabbed television screens and sparked public interest, many reporters tried to contact relatives of the victim who could shed light on this grim event. However, the only one who agreed to talk, although she refused to give her name or even show her face at the time, was Liliana.
Finally, the results of the autopsy became known, and the forensic medical report indicated the cause of death as asphyxia due to compression of the neck, as well as a detailed description of all manipulations performed on the body. Meanwhile, in the run-up to the trial, the prosecution attempted to provide a large number of photographs of the remains. However, after reviewing the images, the trial court excluded several of them, deeming them excessively violent. As argued by the prosecutor appointed to lead the prosecution, Herb Mata, Moses' fatal attack on his mother was not committed in the heat of passion, nor in an impulsive or reckless manner. According to him, it was done for the purpose of devotion to all dark forces and was ultimately the ultimate sacrifice. On Tuesday, February 8, 2011, Moses was formally charged with 1 count of murder. However, as unbelievable as it may sound, he pleaded not guilty. In this case, bail was set at $1 million, which is known to be set when authorities seek to keep a suspect behind bars, primarily because he or she is a danger. As a result, Moses was remanded to the custody of a correctional facility. If convicted of the brutal taking of his mother's life, he faced a maximum sentence of 25 years to life in prison. Already during the trial, the jury was stunned by the detailed report provided by the pathologist when he was called to testify about the deplorable condition of the body he had to examine. For example, he said that the fingertips appeared to have been removed individually with a sharp instrument. The skin on the head had been removed in its entirety except for the eyelids, and all the teeth had been pulled out at the root. Then the testimony of an expert in the study of ritual symbols and unknown practices was presented, who concluded that the location of the body suggests that Moses' actions were ritualistic in nature. In the opinion of the expert, each of the actions performed by the guy had a magical significance for the perpetrator, and was usually a necessary function of the ritual. This means that the dismemberments and other actions were not aimed at the disappearance of evidence, but had a magical meaning, pursued some kind of benefit, and were primarily a form of worship. There was absolute horror on the faces of the judge and on the faces of the others in the room. When asked about disposing of the body in the manner shown in this case, the expert opined that the actions taken went far beyond what was necessary to simply dispose of the body. In addition, the expert identified some of the image symbols found on the laptop Moses found in other parts of the apartment and in the cell as satanic symbols or traces associated with similar beliefs. Some of them were linked to musician King Diamond, whom the expert described as a self-proclaimed follower of Satanist Anton LaVey. Here he gave new information, which threw everyone into even greater horror. He explained that the date of the incident, February 2nd, showed that the fatal attack on Amelia was not accidental, but deliberate because it was a satanic holiday which required very specific rituals, including the sacrifice of people or animals. However, at this point, Moses' lawyer, Jonathan Roberts, spoke up and said that his client's involvement with the Church of Satan was exaggerated and added that modern Satanists do not allow human sacrifice. The truth was that after hearing all the experts called to testify, analyzing the evidence and the parties' arguments, it took the Superior Court jury no more than 1 day to find Moses Miras Espinoza guilty of the first-degree murder of his mother, Amelia Espinoza. At sentencing, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Thomas McNew called the case one of the most disgusting, gruesome, and vulgar of his nearly 50-year career. He then sentenced Moses to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Before he was let out, the judge addressed Moses directly and told him that although he didn't know how he could turn his life around, he would now have time to think about it. Moses' father was present in the courtroom, as well as some members of his family. The young man looked at them as he was let out of the courtroom and did not say a word.